Okay, today's surface water discussion is about wetlands, which is a very important specific type of surface water location. And here's what I need you to do for this presentation today. As you listen through the video and the presentation, I need you to add vocabulary terms to your vocabulary list that we have going in our notebook. Also, take a note of key ideas and concepts. At the end of this presentation, I have a set of questions and a vocabulary list for you to kind of self-check yourself to make sure that you have the definitions you're supposed to, and to make sure that you understand and have learned the key concepts that were presented. First of all, what a wetland is. This is very obviously a definition I want you to have in your vocabulary list. It's land where the soil is full of water and the water table is at the surface. Now, wetland is just what it is. It's land that is sometimes wet. It doesn't have to always be wet. There are some other names. A wetland is a very generic term. Sometimes we call them swamps, marshes, bogs, among other things. So now, how is a wetland different from other types of surface water locations? Okay, it's not a lake or a pond, because lakes or ponds are generally low areas that have water in them all the time. The water has collected and it's sitting there. A wetland is a place where it's sometimes wet and or it has dry areas. And you can see all of these pictures here. You wouldn't call any of these a lake or a pond. If I gave you these pictures before this presentation started and say, what do you call this? Most of you would probably say a swamp, which is one of the terms that we use to describe the more general term that is a wetland. Now, where are wetlands located? This is an idea or a concept that I want you to understand. Wetlands are found in all 50 states, and they're important in all 50 states. Now, obviously, you look at this map and you see there are a lot more wetlands here than there are here, because in the east it is a lot wetter. It rains a lot more. The west is pretty dry. It doesn't rain a whole lot, but all 50 states have at least some locations where the water goes and hangs out and makes the land wet for at least part of the time. So to answer this question, where are wetlands located? All 50 states. But there are more of them in the east than there are in the west because it rains more here.
So this here is the Everglades, which is commonly referred to as a river of grass. That's its nickname. And it's in South Florida, and it just stretches for miles and miles and miles. It covers basically the bottom 1/3 of Florida. And as you can see, there's nothing out there but shallow, swampy land. Now, this is America's largest single wetland, and it is very important for a place like Florida because it rains a lot. And this is a place where all of that water can go and hang out, and it doesn't flood somebody's house or flood somebody's neighborhood. It also gives the water a place where it can go into the ground. It can infiltrate the ground and recharge the aquifer, which is where Florida gets a large portion of its drinking water. So once again, this is the Florida Everglades. It is America's largest single wetland.
Now here's the Everglades very close to Miami, and you can see over here, here's all those houses and roads and parking lots where it rains on top of because it's Florida and it rains a lot, and all that water becomes runoff. Well, that runoff's got to have a place to go. So the Everglades over here are very important because it gives a place for a lot of that runoff water in Florida to go and hang out, where it can then either infiltrate the ground or evaporate back up into the sky. Now, Georgia, we have wetlands in Georgia because there are wetlands in all 50 states. We have one very large, significant wetland, and the largest one here in Georgia is called the Okefenokee Swamp. It's down on the south in South Georgia on the Georgia-Florida border. You've ever been there? It is, you know what a swamp looks like. It's not really a lake. It's not really a river. It's a place where the ground is kind of wet. It is a wet land, and a lot of the rain that falls in our state will end up kind of sliding down to that south part of the state and kind of hang out there in the swamp, where it either evaporates or gets drinking up by plants and put in the air by transpiration, or it sinks into the ground via infiltration. So why are wetlands important? Why do we care? Why are we talking about these? The first, most important aspect of a wetland is flood control. So we know that rivers are carrying runoff water, and rivers can only handle a certain amount of runoff water. And if it rains a lot, we might get too much water in a river that it can handle. Well, a wetland is a place where water can come out of the river and hang out and sit there and not cause problems. But once the water gets in the wetlands, it'll be taken care of. It won't be flooding the river anymore, and it certainly won't be flooding somebody's house or road or neighborhood. Right along the Chattahoochee River, there are places where we have wetlands right here in our area. This over here, this is Roswell Road or Highway 9 that runs through. This is Sandy Springs down here, and Roswell is up here. Centennial is kind of over here off the picture. But down here near the Chattahoochee Nature Center, there are some pretty big, wide, flat, swampy areas alongside the river. Those are wetlands, and they're important. So we're going to take a look at what it looks like and why those wetlands are there. This is the Chattahoochee Nature Center up here, so it would be like the St. Francis School. This is Riverside Drive. So most of you are kind of at least sort of familiar with the area that I'm talking about.
So back there is the Chattahoochee River. And all a river is a large collection of runoff that runs downhill after precipitation and then gets to a low point and goes one direction, usually leading to the ocean. So what happens if there's too much runoff? Say if it rains a lot, or if we have a lot more impervious surfaces like we do here in Atlanta and we get too much runoff. The river can only handle a certain amount of water. So if it rains too much, where does that extra runoff go? You've got to let it go somewhere, otherwise it's going to cause a flood and create problems. Well, what they do here in the Chattahoochee River is this area you see back here behind me looks kind of swampy, it's kind of flat. This is a wetland, and this wetland was left here so that when the Chattahoochee River gets too much water, it flows into this wetland. So what does the water do once it gets in that wetland? Well, it soaks into the ground, or it evaporates up into the air. There's some plants in there that are going to help soak it up and release the water into the air via transpiration. So a wetland is a very important location for excess runoff water to go so that it doesn't cause us problems somewhere else. And you have to leave these wetlands along a river, otherwise you're going to have severe flooding. This particular wetland along the Chattahoochee is along Riverside Drive and Azalea Drive here in Roswell, kind of near the St. Francis School. And this helps keep the Chattahoochee River from flooding when it rains too much and we have too much runoff.
So how do these wetlands help? There's two things that wetlands can do for us. When water comes out of the river can't hold anymore and it goes into the wetland. Two things can happen to the water. One, it will infiltrate the ground, which is good because we kept a lot of water from infiltrating when we made all those impervious surfaces and made too much runoff water in the river in the first place. The second thing is transpiration, and we can also say evaporation. They're kind of the same thing. They're very, very related to one another, very close to the same thing, where water is going up into the air, whether it's just straight evaporation or it's the plants that are in the wetlands that drink it up and then release it into the air. So this is a way to handle excess runoff and help to prevent floods from happening. We take that excess runoff that the river can't handle, put it in the wetland, and it'll either infiltrate or evaporate.
So this is an example of a wetland. You can tell here this is not dry land because you can see all of the water in amongst that grass there. You can tell it's kind of swampy looking. But this is a special type of wetland because it is right on the coast. The ocean in the San Francisco Bay is right there. So this is a tidal wetland. In other words, the high tide comes in and will cover up some of the grass, and the tide goes out, and then it's going to be a little bit drier. A tidal wetland, or a wetland that is found near the coast, is called a marsh, M-A-R-S-H. SH. Now these coastal wetlands, these coastal marshes are really, really important because they give a place for excess stormwater, especially due to hurricanes or especially high tides. They give a place for that extra water to go so that it doesn't wind up over here in our streets, in our homes, in our businesses. So once again, a wetland that is found near the coast is called a marsh.
Here you can see a marsh. This is Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and you can see we've got a lot of buildings and houses and such over here. And if it rains a lot and the water, remember, is trying to go towards the ocean, or we have a bad storm and we have a high tide, the water wants to come ashore more than it usually does. These wetlands, these marshes, these coastal wetlands give a place for water to go and hang out so that it doesn't flood our homes, our businesses, and our streets. Here you can see Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah, Georgia isn't actually built right on the coast. It's a little bit inland because between Savannah and the coast, there's a lot of these coastal wetlands, a lot of these marshes. Now, you could dry the land and you could build on top of the marshes. The problem becomes when it rains really hard, it's just going to flood. When you have a really bad hurricane and the water comes on shore, it's going to flood everything. So these coastal marshes are very important to have a place for excess either runoff or stormwater to go so that it doesn't cause us any flooding problems. Now let's talk about our local wetland. And this is the one we're going to spend a little bit of time on because this is right in our backyard. It's called the Big Creek Greenway. Some of you are familiar with it, some of you aren't. The Big Creek Greenway is right along Big Creek. And that blue line represents the flow of Big Creek. Now, to point out where this is North Point Mall. This is Georgia 400. Here we got Old Alabama Road. There's the connector, like you'd be going to the Mansell Road. You know, Haynesbridge Middle School is going to be like over here somewhere. So, oh, sorry, no, Haynesbridge Middle School. Yeah, it's right over there somewhere. Okay. What the Big Creek Greenway does is give us some wet land where water can go and hang out if we get too much runoff water. And you can see, look at North Point Mall. Look at all those impervious surfaces. All of that water that hits that from precipitation is going to become runoff, and it's going to go somewhere. Well, it's going to go into Big Creek, but Big Creek maybe can't handle all of that runoff. And you can see that in this raised relief, this topographic, this physical map. Here we've got the target at the corner of North Point Parkway and Haynesbridge Road. All impervious surfaces. And you can see here's the Big Creek going down this way. And you'll notice all of these areas here are low points as opposed to the land around them. Well, the low point is where the water is going to want to flood. And that's exactly what happens when it rains too much. The water comes out of Big Creek and it goes into those low-lying areas. And it's filled with plants and trees. And it's not wet all the time. It's only wet after it rains. So here's what it looks like. I'm out here walking on the boardwalk. Maybe you've walked out there or biked out there and it's raised up and you see it's a bunch of plants and trees. And you see there's no water there right now because this is before it rains. Now, if we get a hard rain, things look different. Now I'm in the same spot after it rained really hard. And you can see now the ground is wet. This is a wet land. It's not really a lake or a pond. It's not a river or a stream. This is land that is wet sometimes. And that's a bunch of water just sitting there and hanging out that is going to infiltrate the ground or evaporate. If you've ever been out in the Big Creek, you notice a big difference on the bike paths before and after a rain. Before the rain, it's dry. Go out there after a rain and they typically have to close it because water comes out of the creek and kind of goes and hangs out in the wetlands.
So there's Big Creek over there, and this is just after Tropical Storm or Hurricane Irma came through. And you can see the creek's kind of full and it can't hold all that water. Well, I'm standing here in the big Creek Greenway, and the water can come out of the creek kind of over off to the side here. Just kind of goes over here and kind of hangs out and floods this area over here. Now we need this greenway. We need to leave this land here to be flooded when it rains really hard. Otherwise, all of this water is going to wind up someplace where we don't want it, like in our neighborhoods, at the bottom of the hill in our cul-de-sac, or even in the Chattahoochee River. If we let too much water go in the Chattahoochee River, it's going to flood somebody who lives along the river, say all those houses down there along Riverside Drive. So this is an example of how the greenway works. Big creek catches a lot of water, and when it rains too much, the water comes out of the creek and over here into this floodplain where all the water is allowed to just hang out and doesn't cause anybody any problems.
So, why this talk about the Big Creek Greenway? It is exceptionally important to us here in Roswell. Now, I want to point out to you this map. This is right next to North Point Mall, and you know there's all kinds of businesses and offices and apartments and houses and neighborhoods, and yet there's a bunch of open land along the Greenway. Places where they haven't built houses, they haven't built another store, and even like the North Point Mall, you can kind of see where they built up closer to the Greenway, but they stopped. They didn't get into that area that is wetland, because we need that area to handle excess runoff so that we don't get flooding. This is great prime real estate. I mean, it's close to Georgia 400. It's in a very desirable area. As you can see, there's already a lot of other stuff built there. People live here. But this land will never be built on because we know we have to have that space for excess water to go into those wetlands and hang out so it doesn't cause flooding. You could build a house in the Big Creek Greenway, but two things would happen. One, it's very likely to flood every time it rains. And two, where would the water go? If you don't allow the water to go into the wetlands beside the Greenway, it's going to keep on going to Chattahoochee and flood somebody else as well. So the Big Creek Greenway is very important to us here in Roswell. And Big Creek goes all the way up into Forsyth County. So Roswell, Alpharetta, Cumming, all of these towns need this Big Creek Greenway and their wetlands to be able to handle and deal with all the excess runoff water that we make because of all these impervious surfaces, all these parking lots and roads and houses and buildings and such. So here is a summary of what you should have picked up from this presentation. Only two new vocabularies, wetland and marsh. But you see the concept questions. This is a fairly short presentation, so you will have time at the end of class to be able to ask me, hey, I don't understand why wetlands are important, or what was the name of that largest single wetland? How do you spell that again? You will have the opportunity to ask questions, but this is what you're going to be assessed on. This is what was taught. This is what I expected you to learn. So at this time, flip back through your notes. If you don't know the answer to any of these, either in your head or on your paper, please don't hesitate to ask.